Welcome to another episode of Vendée Radio, and today I am honoured to be joined by Mr. Luis Infante. Mr. Luis Infante is a mutual friend of a friend of mine, Dr. Miguel Ayuso Torres, and he is a prominent member of the contemporary Carlist movement, the Comunión Tradicionalista. He is a prominent member of the Secretariat for Prince Don Sixto Enrique de Bourbon Parma, and has held a variety of teaching positions in the Carlist movement across many decades. He also is a prominent translator and teacher of Carlist thought. So, Mr. Infante, it is a great pleasure to speak to you. Buenos dias. Well, I've been looking forward to talking with you for a long time because the Carlist movement really exerts a fascination on me, and I think any counter-revolutionary Catholic, for a number of reasons, I think it's one of the most remarkable counter-revolutionary legitimist traditional movements in Christendom, really. Certainly one of the most long-lived, and the amount of scholarship that's available in the English language is quite small. So it's a real privilege to speak to someone with as much knowledge and experience as yourself about the Carlist movement. So I think something that most traditional Catholics are aware of when they consider the Carlist movement is the Carlist motto, if you like, of Dios, Patria, Fueros. So could you just expand on that motto for us as a starting point, as a preamble to consider the significance of the Carlist movement?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, that was a very kind introduction of yours, maybe excessively generous, but right, coming to our motto, God, Dios. That obviously refers us to the basic identity of Spain, of the Spaniards. A Carlist thinker of the 19th century stated that Catholic unity was Spain's constitution, and against which no law, no decision of those in authority could stand. Now, Catholic unity is a conception which goes far beyond Catholic confessionalism, as some others would have it. I mean, it is not the government, the state, the king, proclaiming themselves Catholic. In fact, they don't even do that. Proclamation of Catholicism is something that was introduced in Spain by the liberals in order to disguise their own their own agenda, their own real intentions. Catholic unity basically means that Spain, as a political entity, came into existence at the Third Council of Toledo, a couple of centuries before the Islamic invasion. And it came into existence when the Visigoth king, Recaredo, Richard if you like, officially converted to Catholicism, renouncing the Arian heresy that Visigoths had professed before, and his court with him. So those were the last non-Catholics left in Spain at the time. Catholic unity was attained then, and since then it's been the main referral for Spanish politics to this day, which opens interesting arguments in contemporary Catholic thought, but we'll leave that for later. So Catholic unity basically means everything in Spain is Catholic, and anything that goes against that must be rejected. So that's actually the main thing about Carlist political thought. Of course, that also has consequences. Patria, fatherland, our country, it is exactly that after God. It is a political community that developed throughout history, and that has a series of characteristics handed down from generation to generation, and that bind us together as a political community. So that's something that we are bound to defend, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, basically along the lines of the fourth commandment of God's law, the saying that you will have to honor thy father and thy mother, you will honor thy fatherland. Fueros, That's always been a difficult word to translate because it is etymologically, you can go back to the Roman Forum, etc., but its development throughout Spain's legal history has led to a meaning that whenever I've had to translate it into English, I've always needed that nasty resource of footnotes because it is basically impossible to translate otherwise. Sometimes the English word charter works, sometimes. Like, for example, municipal charters, like, fueros granted by the king to different local entities, or university charters, that sort of thing. But it goes beyond that because it connects both to the two main legal traditions that you will find in the source of Spanish law, that is Roman law and Visigothic law, plus custom, local custom that sometimes goes far beyond the Roman tradition. They all combine to form that legal tradition with, of course, the proper concept of natural law, the one as explained by the Church. And that forms an interesting body which in a traditional conception of society is not a legal code in the modern way, in the modern fashion that in which somebody, you may call it parliament or whatever, supposedly representing the nation, starts issuing laws and making a systematic organization of those laws. No, the concept of fueros means that there is a lot of laws and regulations that predate the state itself and cannot be done away with. And in fact, they will take precedence over the decisions of the central government, even over the decisions of the king. There is an extreme expression of that in the old oath that the Cortes of Aragon took when a new king was installed, which, well, this is a shortened form, it's not that the real one is much longer, but it was something like, nos que valemos tanto como vos y todos juntos más que vos, juramos obedeceros si respetáis nuestros fueros, y si no, no. Meaning, we, who are as good as you, meaning the king, and altogether better than you, swear to obey you as long as you abide by our fueros, by those regulations. And if you don't, we won't. Again, it's maybe a little bit of an extreme form of expressing it, but I think it's quite graphic for a short explanation.
Yes.
The king, and then we come to the fourth part, the king. The king is an effective king. It's not a puppet as in the form of constitutional or parliamentary monarchies. The king rules, but his powers are limited by traditional laws and of course by natural law and God's law, and he has no authority against those. He needs to abide by them. Mm-hmm. So he is an effective ruler, definitely, but he is not a contemporary ruler, because it's interesting nowadays we will find all these ideas, all these words being thrown around by contemporary historians of absolute monarchy and despotic monarchy and all that, often without realizing that even at their most despotic, the old monarchies, like, I don't know, take Louis XIV in France, for example, did not at all exert a power similar to modern, to contemporary democratic governments. Contemporary democratic governments have a power in every respect far exceeding what the old monarchies would even attempt to have. They couldn't even dream of it. It's not that they didn't dream of it because they were not capable of attaining it. It's that it was beyond the very mindset of the time to try and acquire and exert as much power as modern governments do.
Yes.
I don't know if that explanation will do, or maybe I've wandered away from the subject.
No, certainly that's really fascinating, and I think will serve as a very helpful foundation for some of the other questions I'd like to explore in our time. So to return to a point that you made, I think right at the beginning about the nature of Catholic unity, this is something that I think traditional Catholics can dwell on, because since the doctrine of the social kingship of Christ the King has been very much eclipsed in the modern church and attacked, and more Catholics are rediscovering this great truth, which is the mission of the lay apostolate as well. They continue to think of the confessional state as the ideal to be aimed for, whereas, as you said there, the Carlist movement has always realized that Catholic unity is the ideal. Could you say something about that, about how the confessional state is actually a decadence, because it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it arises from the religious wars and the Treaty of Westphalia, and the idea that, for example, on one side of the Rhine, a man is justified by faith, and then on the other side of the Rhine, soteriological truth changes so that he's justified by faith in good works. Why is Catholic unity the only answer?
Yes, you're absolutely right in sort of dating the idea in that time. It would come into Catholic countries later, basically in the 19th century. And it would come through two ways, I should say. The first, of course, is in some countries, mostly in Spain, it was impossible to introduce revolution in its raw form, like the French Revolution. That didn't stand a chance here, as the Napoleonic War clearly proved. Mm-hmm. People, even the most humble, would not tolerate it. Any attempt at establishing a new regime that didn't at least pretend to be a monarchy, and pretend to be a Catholic monarchy at that, would have mostly every other Spaniard, not every other, every Spaniard jumping at the neck of those that were trying to impose that. So revolution had to disguise itself as a monarchy, a diminished monarchy, with some people holding the crown that were not entitled to proper succession rights, and at the same time it had to issue a series of constitutions that in their preamble pompously affirmed the Catholic confessionalism of the state, of the government at the time. But of course, first problem is if religion is upheld by a legal proclamation, it may as well cease to be upheld the moment the legal proclamation changes. If you are ruled by a written constitution that was put together by a group of people, well, another group of people may change that, and then you will have a new referral, like modern secularism at the time. However, that kind of trick of confessionalism was also a trap in which a number of prominent Catholics and churchmen fell in the name of the lesser evil policy. Now, the lesser evil policy has been the source of the greatest evil imaginable. But at certain points in history, it's a temptation for many. And some of them probably well-intentioned, some of them not so well-intentioned. So, you have those two influences, those people that will go for the lesser evil thing and people that know how to disguise the real intentions. For example, the very much misrepresented Constitution of 1812, they usually call it the first constitution in Spain. It's actually the second after the Bayonne Statute that the Bonapartes put together, which is a disgraceful thing, a totally illegitimate constitution made by totally legitimate Cortes, but never mind, we won't get into that now. But it has a preamble that is really Catholic, and aggressively Catholic, meaning that it states not only the Catholicism of the Spanish monarchy of both sides of the ocean, but also the strict prohibition of any other form of religious thought or worship. But then, as you proceed on after the preamble, you realize that the Constitution is basically a copy of the French Revolutionary Constitution of 1791, actually the most radical of them all. So it is immediately contradicted but nicely disguised. So Catholic unity, on the contrary, has no possibility for that sort of trick. Meaning, we are Catholic because we are Catholic. We're not proclaiming it. It's just a fact. We were born Catholic as a society. We were born Catholic as a political community, as a monarchy, and that's the way we are. And if we are not Catholic, we're nothing else.
Yes.
And then the late 19th century historian Marcelino Menéndez Pelayo, who was a curious case because he was, in his thinking, he's basically a traditionalist. In his political practice, he was a liberal conservative. So he's always been an interesting presence in Spain's history and in Spain's historical thought there. But nevertheless, most of his writings, most of his speeches are right and sound traditional. He basically stated something pretty obvious, which is the moment Spain ceases to be Catholic, it simply ceases to exist. We cannot be anything but Catholic. A society always has a religious foundation, even if it doesn't acknowledge it, like modern secularism, which is a form of religion with a set of dogmas and that actually enforces upon people. In our case, that's what binds us together. That's why traditionally we've talked about these Spains in plural rather than Spain, because the Spains are formed by a series of kingdoms and principalities and regions linked together by faith in the same God and loyalty to the same king, and little else. We'll now refer to Fueros. In everything else, we've stuck to our traditional laws, which are different from region to region. There's been an assorted number of languages. Spanish is the most common and historically has become the common one, but the others were used naturally. In fact, the very idea of an official language only comes into existence in the 20th century, and that already within the liberal state. Nothing such as official languages existed. So it may be, but it will be a very long discussion, but it may refer to what some thinkers actually in the English-speaking world have labeled natural political communities as opposed to artificial political communities.
Yes, organicism.
So, yes. So the Spain Carlism defense is actually the old one, the natural one. It is not an ideological construct of any sort. Carlism appears in history basically as a movement of resistance. It is actually the old Spain resisting the revolutionary imposition and refusing to cease to exist. That's basically the meaning of Carlism up to this day. We uphold what we were and the only thing that we can actually be.
Yes, I remember reading from Dr. Ayuso how the first Carlist movement, the nascent Carlist movement in the early 19th century from Don Carlos V, it was an organic reaction to a cancer that had invaded the body politic and was in inchoate recognition that if that cancer wasn't eliminated, then it would overtake the body and destroy it. But I want to just explore a little bit more about something about the Spanish soul, because Dr. Ayuso once said to the American Dr. Robert Hickson something very interesting. He said, quote, "The true soul of Spain is to be found in the incarnation of Christian chivalry." And it's noticeable that Spain is the only nation in Christendom to militarily defeat the three of the great enemies of the Catholic Church in history. The Mohammedans in the Reconquista, the longest war in history, the liberals with the guerrillas against Napoleon, and then the Reds, the socialists, during the Civil War of the last century. So, and this is also quite mystical, because I'm sure you've heard of the small t tradition, that the legionaries that put our Lord to death were actually from Spain, were Hispanic, and so there's something very visceral about Spanish Catholicism. And you see it in the writings of St. John of the Cross, where he says that the crucifixion must be depicted as realistically as possible. And you see it in the incredible statues and realism of the crucified Lord in Spanish churches and in the Semana Santa processions as well. And finally, Salvador Dali once theorized that the very name of Spain, España, has a relationship to the word espinia, meaning thorn. So I wonder if you can say something about this primordial light of the Spanish soul.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's actually been quite a bit of controversy as to whether those Roman legionaries were actually from Hispania or were from Asia Minor. There's another option. Something else that is probably more agreed upon is that Flavia, Pontius Pilate's wife, was actually from Spain, from today's León. And I'm sure you know that, at least for traditionally in the Eastern Church, has been held to be a saint. Yes, the Spanish Christianity is a very early one. And there's a historian, I forget which one now, of course, that actually states that by the 4th century, Roman Hispania was basically all Christian. So it's a very early kind of total Christianization. And at the same time, many of these authentic Christianity was at some stage common to pretty much the whole of Christendom. But unfortunately, many other areas in Christendom later suffered other influences that Spain was largely free of. If you look at the history of Spain, for example, the religious history of Spain, it is remarkable how the country was kind of a natural repellent for heresies. Very few important heresies ever took root. Well, I should say none of them took root, but had presence. Some did, very short-lived, and were quickly eliminated, and they left basically no mark. And also modern Christian sensitivities, as the ones influenced by late Renaissance thinking, Erasmism, and then Protestant contagion, as it happened in many other European countries, and then Jansenism and Gallicanism, etc., did not really ever influence Spanish Catholicism, even in devotional forms, artistic forms, etc. So Spanish Catholicism pretty much stuck to those always realistic ways. Maybe, of course, never losing sight that the passion and death of our Lord are the center of our faith, and I purposefully leave resurrection out, not because it isn't, but because nowadays it is very often relied upon to forget the passion of death and death, and actually we're only redeemed and we're only open to be saved by the passion and death. And there's no resurrection without passion and death, of course, and there's no atonement of sins without the passion and death of our Lord. Well, that was never lost sight of in Spain. And even you were referring to the Holy Week processions. We are now in a historical law of Catholicism in Spain. It's never been as bad as it is now. Nevertheless, it's interesting how mostly all over Spain, except in some regions that have been decatholized even further, Holy Week processions remain very important. The typical criticism aimed at them will be that they are superficial and folklore and whatnot. Well, there's an element of that, of course, but at the same time it is remarkable that they've survived in spite of the open hostility from the clergy. It is actually the people that have preserved those.
The liturgy of the streets.
Yes, exactly, and a catechetical form of reminding people of what Holy Week is all about, which has to be seen because it's out in the streets for everyone to see it.
Yes.
And also, if you want even a proud, aggressive display of Catholicism, those remains of the old order are, quite hopeful when you see them. There's the element, of course, especially in those places where the religious confraternities are still very important, those clergymen that were so hostile to them have reduced their hostility in order to be able to try and conduct them, and their influence is obviously bad. Just to quote a personal example, I think is pretty good at that. I belong to a certain religious confraternity that makes its procession on actually on Holy Tuesday, and Good Friday processions are usually referred to as the silent processions, but actually they usually call ours silent procession, even if it is on Tuesday, because it's absolutely silent. Every member of the confraternity makes a vow of silence before going out, and it's a long one that takes hours, and it's quite a hard one. But of course, there's always one person that breaks the silence and acts stupidly, the chaplain. So that's probably the greatest danger that the survival of Spanish Catholicism has is today's clergy. I'm digressing, so we'll leave it there.
Spain, hammer of heretics, light of Trent, evangelizer of half the world, sword of Rome, cradle of Ignatius. This is our greatness and our unity. We have no other. In what way does the Carlist movement serve as a bridge, the purity of the Carlist movement serve as a bridge to the old Spain, to Hispanidad?
Actually, the quotation just made, as I'm sure you know, is from Marcelino Menéndez Pelayo that I just mentioned. And it's, of course, a perfectly valid definition, even as for today. Carlism is the last remaining part of that Spain. It's the last that was the last trench that we that we resist in. To start with, I was going to say, in contemporary words, no other political movement represents that. But of course, although contemporarily Carlism is also a political movement, as we mentioned before, it's not essentially or originally that. It is actually kind of natural resistance that eventually evolves into a political movement when it cannot totally defeat the revolutionary regime imposed upon us. And Carlism has never ceased to be and has never ceased to contemplate itself as that, as the last surviving stronghold of the old Spain, and it's attempted to preserve that political thinking, that even those social structures that belong to Spain's past has always tried to keep them alive, or at least to keep their memory alive, so that they eventually be restored. So yeah, that's the very essence of it. That's why the attempts of deviation that Carlist has suffered throughout history, especially in the last 60 years or so, have always ended up failing, because the moment any new ideas are introduced, Carlism ceases to be that I'm trying to look for a word which of course I cannot remember, but that last stronghold of traditional Spain, and it becomes something else. It becomes another political movement, and that simply doesn't work, and it's of course not followed by Carlists. Carlists may get discouraged and go home, but they're not going to join any political experiment.
Dr. Ayuso made a very interesting observation, even a deliciously provocative one, actually. And he said that Spanish traditionalism, Carlism, is really one of the only doctrinally pure counter-revolutionary movements in Europe. So he says that in France, for example, what might be called counter-revolutionary thought is plagued by numerous doctrinal errors. If we think of the theological school, quote-unquote, of de Maistre, Blanc Saint-Bonnot, or even the positivist, the later positivist school of Taine and Murat, it evinces earlier Gallicanist and absolutist currents, which are not helpful, and it sort of moves in Cartesian channels. And to quote from him, he says, "This means that after the great revolutions of the late 18th century, the reactions were to be constructed from certain branches of the same anti-metaphysical matrix that brought forth the Enlightenment and the revolution against those who wanted to rise up. In Spain, this was not the case. All throughout Spain, the tradition of Christian philosophy was maintained, and I say this of mainland Spain as well as Spanish America. This is what explains the singular purity of Spanish traditionalism, scholastic philosophy, and basically the survival of Thomism. Whatever your point of view, along with some great discoveries and probably some not so small errors, there remained a tradition of sound thought. This distinguishes the traditionalism of the Hispanic stamp, not only from that of France but of Europe in general. Thus, in the Anglo-Saxon world, the metaphysical split observed in France is also sifted through political events, which reconciled the revolution with its evolution. In Germany, meanwhile, Romanticism, heir to the spirit of emancipation formed by the Enlightenment, added a Dionysian element to the revolt that tinges all counter-revolutionary thought, and in Poland, limiting ourselves to a few examples, the counter-revolution is linked almost exclusively to pure nationalism, i.e. the assertion of independence. Then, in all countries, in all cultural fields, except in the Spanish domain, we find that the counter-reaction is played out in a series of side events that detract from its purity of doctrine. This does not happen among us."
As you rightly say, that's both provocative and true. When dealing with traditionalists from other cultural traditions and with Catholic sympathizers abroad, if these things are mentioned, they always bring about some sort of a public relations problem. How to word it without sounding offensive, which is of course never the intention, or even sounding nationalistic, which is something that horrifies a true Carlist, because nationalism couldn't be farther from our mindset. But unfortunately, that's historically true. I mean, take the example of France, which may be the most prominent in the sense of how things mix there. Of course, although there are strange elements in his thinking, I would probably exclude the Mestre from that list, as the Mestre was not French, but Savoyan, and actually he was very clear about it. He always rejected being considered a Frenchman. But, okay, for example, the French monarchy has Protestant kings. And I do not mean Henry IV that converts in order to become King of France after being King of Navarre and all that. I actually mean Francis I and Henry II. Francis I and Henry II, and we are already going back to the 16th and 17th century, were formally Protestants. Francis I is even a contributor to the Confession of Augsburg. He is all the way a full-fledged Protestant. Also, false philosophy, mainly Cartesian school, makes its inway into mainstream French thinking to the extent that it actually extinguishes proper scholasticism. Thomistic thinking is not to be found in France in the 18th century. It's simply not there anymore. And that considering that what we talk nowadays called France offers some historical difficulties. Let me explain. The reforms of the Council of Trent, for example, only come into effect in Parisian France, and I will now explain what I mean by Parisian France, after the Revolution, with the Napoleonic restoration of the Church. Prior to that, in those parts of what we nowadays call France that were directly under the Kingdom of Paris historically, they had never been accepted. The Gallican, I was going to say heresy, it is a heresy, but then of course it is a public relations problem again, so I won't dwell into it, had prevented it. There is also, of course, Burgundy France, that for a long time was actually effectively under the kings of the Spains as well. Now in Burgundy France, meaning the Franche-Comté and French, nowadays called French Flanders and other areas, those had actually tridentinized in time. And it's interesting, as a French historian himself observes, Jean Dimont, that between the 16th century, almost 15th century, and the 19th century, Parisian France does not produce a single cent. Well, I don't know now with the, how can I put it, free market canonizations that started flourishing after the 1980s, but prior to that, they only had one blessed proclaim that was actually heavily critical against the kings of France. Can't remember the name now. All other French saints of the period actually come from the Burgundy influence area, and also from the areas like the Roussillon and Sardaigne that were under the King of the Spains until Louis XIV. That basically means a country that had not done away with Catholicism entirely, but hindered it in such a way that when revolution came, even counter-revolutionaries were, as Professor Bayuso points out, basically revolutionaries of a more conservative sort. So they had to improvise a counter-revolutionary thinking, and they didn't have the tools. Neo-Thomism was the big thing in France and many other countries at the beginning of the 20th century. Neo-Thomism was never important in Spain simply because the old Thomism had not disappeared, and it was still the core of both theological and political thinking in Spain. Yes. I don't know if that explains it, or...
No, that's a very acute analysis, and I think there's a lot there to research and consider. I'd like to move forward in history a little bit to the 20th century. As I remarked earlier, such a prominent characteristic of Carlism is its longevity and its frequent revivals throughout the centuries. And when researching Carlism, a figure that really impressed themselves on me was Manuel Falconde in the 1930s in particular. He was remarkably young when he became, the General Secretary of the Traditional Communion, but he'd done incredible things in the south of Spain, and I don't think it's a stretch to say he was something of an organizational genius. What I think is particularly interesting is how he utilized what you could call modern methods to advance the cause of tradition. And I wonder if you could comment on how the Traditional Communion grew in the years prior to the Civil War, and what that can teach us today about how a traditional Catholic movement can utilize modern methods while still maintaining its doctrinal purity and cohesion.
Yes, you're definitely right. Manuel Falconde was an organizational genius. It wasn't the first time, it was not the first time that Carlism had reorganized itself in such a way as to be up to the new ways, new times, and use them to its benefit or to the benefit of its cause. In the 1860s, 1870s, there is something similar when in the early days of Charles VII. New propaganda techniques and new organization are brought about, and they become quite successful. Even after later on, after Carlist defeat in the Third Carlist War, there is again a new reorganization of things when the círculos, literally circles, the clubs, Carlist clubs, become widespread in Spain, and they are effective in keeping people together and assuring the transmission of the cause and its principles and its conception of life. And they will go on until the war, and they will had a very hard time recovering after the war because, of course, the General Franco's attempt at a totalitarian state made them illegal, so they had to survive in clandestinity and all that. But Don Manuel Falconde has a very interesting approach to things. He was the first prominent politician that decided that the Republic that was proclaimed in 1931 had to be done away with, and that would probably require violence. And Carlism is different from the other forces that joined to overthrow the Popular Front in 1936, because the others were only against the Popular Front. Popular Front was, in spite of their romanticization lately, the Popular Front was so bad that brought together very different people and very different forces, including historical Republicans. I mean, most of those Republicans that had proclaimed the Republic only 5 years before sided on the national side against the Popular Front. That's why it is so wrong to call the red side in the Spanish Civil War, as it is current nowadays, the Republican side or the Loyalist side. There was nothing of the sort. Unfortunately, I would say as a Carlist, the Republicans were on our side, not on theirs.
Yes, and Freemasons as well. And
yes, of course. Well, Freemasons were actually on both sides, but that's another story. So Don Manuel Falconde takes the Traditionalist Communion and, with the King's agreement and express support, basically turns it into a war machine.
Yeah.
A very effective propaganda machine as well. They developed new forms of propaganda. They renewed the Carlist press of the time. For example, he took the old Madrid periodical El Siglo Futuro and turned it into what became the Spain's most modern newspaper of the time. Everything machinery, distribution, etc. And yeah, the Carlist propaganda and activity between 1932 and 1936 was hectic. And it's impressive to see the number of new Carlist organizations that were put in place and the enormous expansion in numbers. But there was another thing. The increase of sectarian attack against the faith and against the church was so sudden and so strong. And moderate Catholics were so inefficient in opposing it that many people that had so far supported the lesser evil thing and said, well, things are not so bad, at least for the faith and public morality and all that, all of a sudden realized that they could no longer pursue those policies and something stronger was needed. And Carlist was there, and it became a center of attraction for many Catholics that were formerly apolitical or that had allowed themselves to accept more moderate forms. So yes, in 1936, Carlism is an enormous force, to the extent that Manuel Falconde even considered the possibility of going to war alone, without other forces or the agreement with certain portions of the army. Basically, he also expected, of course, that those certain portions of the army would eventually be dragged along, but he actually had planned the uprising just as a Carlist uprising.
So the uprising takes place in July 1936, and the war begins that Martin Blinkhorn called the Fourth Carlist War. As you say, the Carlist requetés were crucial to the eventual success of the crusade. So in what sense did the Carlist forces and the Carlist movement help guarantee the success of the nationalist side? I'm thinking, for example, the use of the two-colour flag and the infusing of the uprising with the characteristic of a crusade.
Yes, of course. Both last things you mentioned, the flag and the character of crusade for the war, were actually Carlist impositions. And I mean impositions. Both the army and other political forces and characters involved in the uprising were for a republican dictatorship, something that did away with the Popular Front, socialists, communists, and anarchists, and reinstalled order, and then it would resume business as usual. Also, the political ideas of some of the generals involved were, couldn't be farther away from Catholicism. General Mola, the director of the uprising, was himself a Republican soldier with little or no religious interests, and quite hostile to Catholicism, to Carlism, in fact. But it's interesting what would have happened if he hadn't died in that accident, because after the uprising started, he suffered a sort of contagion of enthusiasm from the Carlists around him.
His son was a Carlist as well, is that right?
No, not General Mola's son. You're probably
General Sanjurjo?
General Sanjurjo himself was of Carlist extraction.
Okay.
Although both his grandfathers had actually fought in the Third Carlist War on the Carlist side.
Yes.
He had stranded away from Carlism, but when he was in exile in Portugal, Don Manuel Falconde started cultivating him, and he eventually was gained back for the cause. And he was, of course, the leader, the military leader of the uprising, who, as you know, also died in an accident. So General Sanjurjo would have guaranteed a Carlist prevalence in the national side, probably, not definitely, but probably. General Mola will have been more in favor of it, probably as well. Remains to be seen, but there are hints that suggest it. And General Franco would rather have had a less Catholic, more modern political organization, definitely. When he's actually, after the death of the other two generals, when he's actually proclaimed Generalissimo and head of government in Salamanca on the 1st of October 1936, his first radio message actually says explicitly that the new government will be totalitarian and secular. Now, that actually causes such a stir, such a scandal, even with the bishop in Salamanca threatening him personally, that they gradually back up from that. And the Catholic atmosphere, the crusade atmosphere that had largely been instilled by Carlism, was a social reality. So they couldn't ignore it. But we have at the time this strange thing. We were talking about confessionalism of government before. The first law of the new state that actually proclaims Spain to be Catholic is 1945. That is 9 years after Franco gets in charge of it. And that's, of course, the year when the Axis loses the war. Yes. And Franco's government needs to rely upon the Vatican support to survive internationally. So then they cave in, and of course, as I say, social atmosphere was largely in favor of it, but they had maintained this legal ambiguity until 1945. So, nevertheless, yes, Catholicism was the main social reason for people joining the uprising. Basically, Catholic Spain refused to allow itself to be exterminated. And this is another of those elements that are usually done away with in contemporary accounts of the war. In 1937, due to political pressure, international political pressure, and to serious public relations problems, the Red government issues new regulations allowing Catholic worship, but it must be kept private on the Red side, which simply means it had been forbidden before, point one, and point two, it was totally ineffective, because all available priests had either been killed or were in clandestinity, or had managed to run away and transfer to the national side. So we're really talking about a serious attempt to destroy Catholicism in Spain that was carried out by the Popular Front. The reaction against that on, as I say, old school politicians and generals was largely just trying to moderate things. But then there was this strong Catholic influx that basically Carlism channeled. So yeah, it is a crusade because Carlists are there. Otherwise, it would have simply been a coup d'etat and a civil war.
Yes. Yes, and the Red Terror, the mass murder of clergy and religious in particular, I believe was the greatest mass killing of clergy and religious, I think, since the persecution of Diocletian.
Yes, and in fact, in a much smaller territory. Yeah, the numbers are frightening.
Yes.
The numbers are frightening, not to mention the enormous number of lay people that were killed for religious reasons. I mean, in my hometown, the popular courts found enough for capital punishment, things like he carried a confraternity standard in religious processions, so he was sentenced to death, or this family had a Sacred Heart plate on their door, which of course there were thousands of them, but they were hastily removed in July 1936 to try and survive. That sort of thing. Yeah, it is scary to think that then it was a largely Catholic society, and nevertheless this was attempted upon it.
Yes.
What sort of thing lies in future for us now that we are no longer a properly Catholic society at large? But yeah, they did attempt it. And they very nearly succeeded.
Yes. Well, I'd like to consider more contemporary questions in the latter part of this interview. So you touched on the interaction of the Franco regime with Carlism, and then there's the figure of Don Carlos Hugo Bourbon Palmer. His place as the Carlist regent prompts the question: how could a Carlism become left-wing, and how did this affect the Carlist movement up to the current day, and the contemporary Comunión Tradicionalista and the regent, His Royal Highness Don Sixto Enrique de Bourbon Palmer, and what happened at the Montejura incident?
All right. Now, the interaction between Franco's regime and Carlism. First of all, Franco's regime is a very interesting subject on its own right, meaning that would probably be more accurate to refer to it as regimes, plural, only with Franco at its pinnacle. But if you consider that it changes from a crypto-fascist totalitarian state to an organic democracy, and from exaltation of the leader, the caudillo, to a traditional monarchy without a king, which was its later definition, it shows that, it was a constant improvisation. Bear in mind that it had no head of state until the 1950s, because Franco had been agreed upon as head of government in October 1936. Then his right-hand man at the time, also his brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, introduced that funny thing of jefe del gobierno del Estado, that is, head of the government of the state, so that they could do away with the government and call him head of the state, but he was not constitutionally head of the state until the 1950s. When the subject of Francoism comes up in Spain nowadays, which is surprisingly often,
Yes.
considering that it's been 40 years now, 45 years after his death, I usually say this because I remember I'm old enough to even remember his days, and Francoism can seriously only be condemned by traditionalists. Let me try to quickly explain that. It was not a good government, but it was better than the government before it and better than the government after it. which doesn't make it good. It simply makes it comparatively better.
Yes.
As I do not uphold any sort of lesser evil policies, that's not enough for me. That's not enough for Carlists. And that also posed a constant problem for Carlists throughout his regime, in the sense that Carlist was against him, and he was against Carlism very much. But at the same time, the thought of siding with the Reds and the opposition abroad was unthinkable for Carlists. So we were left in that position that we had to be against him, but at the same time be careful not to sort of topple it so that the balance would actually benefit, the loss of balance would actually benefit the Reds, benefit the Liberals, etc.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, the first open deviation of former Prince Carlos Hugo. Carlos Hugo was a very gifted man, apart from a true royal, but at the same time, he had a strange leaning for heterodoxy and for forgetting his royal duties. When he actually became part of active Carlism and of Spanish politics in the late 50s, 1960s, his father, King Xavier, a most devout man, is said to have congratulated and expressed his appreciation to the Carlist entourage that looked after Carlos Hugo, because among other things, he had started going back to church again. That gives you an idea of what an oddball he was in the middle of his family. And well, his first open deviation is actually collaborationism with Francoism, and that starts causing a stir within Carlism. He actually veers towards no longer antagonizing Francoism, but trying to get along and eventually, ultimate aspiration, be recognized as successor by Franco. He was definitely best positioned in that respect because Carlist was a strong political movement then, with a strong political support that all other candidates that Franco could actually consider for his succession did not have. Not at all, in fact. But at the same time, it was a very weird approach to politics from a Carlist standpoint, and that started antagonizing old Carlists and making people withdraw from active politics. That, quite naturally, considering Francoism of the time, evolved into contacts with the European Christian democracy of the time, which were, of course, met even with greater hostility among Carlist ranks, but still the adhesion to the royal family and the presence of his father there was very much respected, prevented most people from openly disagreeing with that.
Yes.
And then, of course, the great disaster came, Vatican II.
Yeah.
And Vatican II enabled a complete turnover of things within the Catholic world. And for a strictly Catholic movement like Carlism was, it was total chaos. How are we going to defend Catholic unity in the light of the Conciliar Declaration on Religious Freedom?
Yeah.
And that's only one of the many elements of it. Even those Catholics that were most militantly Catholic in the apparently or seemingly good sense in the 1950s often became weird revolutionaries, third world style, in the 1960s. Also, for a movement with such a large presence of clergy within its ranks as Carlist was, well, when clergy lost their heads, so did most of the people around them. A late Carlist thinker and activist, Jesus Evaristo Casariego, used to say that Carlist could have easily survived strong enough to overthrow things in the 1970s to either the treason of Prince Carlos Hugo or to Vatican II. But to the combined effect of both,
Right.
it could only survive in small numbers, but
Yes.
it could no longer preserve its strength.
And the cultural and sexual revolution of the 1960s as well.
Yes, that probably affected less Carlism in the sense that even Vatican II and Novus Ordo Catholicism in Spain, the mainstream one, still stayed quite morally and socially conservative until the 80s. But yeah, it definitely those that were compromised with more modern, more extreme forms of progressivism, progressivist Catholicism, easily fell to that as well. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the last remaining members of Carlos Hugo's party, which basically and after the 1980s it basically disappears, but they were weird. Like they were promoting abortion and the rights of the sodomites at the time when other portions of the Spanish left wing didn't. So,
Oh, yes. Corruptio optima pessima est. So, thank you. And you now have the Comunión Tradicionalista upholding is it correct to say the regency of His Royal Highness Don Sixto Enrique de Bourbon?
it is correct in the sense that when Carlos Hugo definitely loses his rights, his children are already in existence. So Don Sixto, his younger brother, becomes a regent because he's still proclaiming the rights of his nephews. But that's a long time ago. His nephews have lost their rights themselves completely and entirely. So Don Sixto is in fact de facto the king.
Yes.
The king de facto, the king de jure, if you can follow that. Well, official proclamation hasn't been made yet. Those things are usually done very carefully. Although for a number of years now he's been exerting powers that are usually considered limited to royalty. For example, maybe the most meaningful, well, not meaningful, the most significant ones, maybe things related to the order, the royal orders, like the order of proscribed legitimacy, or the recognition of titles of nobility that have been, in which the succession has been, perturbed by the new laws in Spain. If Don Sixto is actually asked to recognize the succession to a title by someone has lost it to a sister or whatever, he will actually do it. And in fact, it is common for the Carlist people when Don Sixto appears to shout "Viva el Rey," long live the king. Even 3 years ago, in the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of 3 years ago, the 40th anniversary of his father's death, a commemorative medal was coined, which simply says Xavier I, Henry V, and that's Don Sixto. Yes. So he still goes by the title of regent, but everyone knows he's the king.
Yes. And could you elaborate on the place of Carlism in our contemporary world, and perhaps any considerations on the future? Firstly, any considerations on the successor of His Royal Highness, Don Sixto Enrique de Borbon, and also a quotation from Don Sixto, I think maybe from that celebration you referred to. He said, quote, "Today there is a certain reaction. Proof of this is in this same meeting. Many Catholics, in view of our perseverance, approach us. The traditional communion boasts of having kept intact the principles of true Carlism and makes itself available to all who want to follow such principles in their purity." End quote. So I wonder if you could throw a little light on some of the prospects there for the steadfast witness of Carlism and potential for growth there. Elias de Tejada said that the panorama of modernity is the movement from Christianitas Major to the Christianitas Minor to today's Christianitas Minima. And when I spoke to Dr. Ayuso last year, he said that even if the political arena is closed to us, to Catholic action, we can work in the pre-political, which is the cultural. I wonder if you can say something to those points.
I'll try. It is true that Carlism is reduced in numbers nowadays, although there are signs of recovery, and not in large numbers, but new people keep coming steadily. And it also maintains and even increases a capability of fight in the cultural world that is probably unequaled by any other political movement. If you see the yearly production of serious papers and books and reviews and articles that come from within Carlism, is actually quite impressive. It is also true that the very lack of any other movement or organization approaching even effectively to pretend the preservation of solid principles attracts those that sometimes from widely different original thinking come to Carlism as something more solid. Maybe an anecdote will help. The same thinker I quoted before, which is not very well known international, but he was quite well known nationally in the past, Casariego, Jesus Evaristo Casariego, is now dead, ran for the Senate in Asturias in the 1977 election, and also in some partial elections that took place about 2 years later. He ran for Congress. And with a very limited budget, he actually got quite a number of votes. I mean, 20,000 votes, something like that, which is quite a lot in a small region. Yeah. And not long before he died, I attended one of his lectures, and he was actually on the Santiago de Compostela, but about Santiago de Compostela. But at the end, two old men approached and identified themselves as Red veterans from the Civil War, and they were asking him when he was running for Congress again, because they had voted for him, because he represented something solid, something real. Brilliant. Not mushy modern politics, and they wanted that. Yes. Well, this is an individual, but that sort of attraction may be exerted by Carlism on many. For some, the strict orthodoxy, and from others that will hopefully be attracted into orthodoxy eventually, that very solidity, that lack of compromise that Carlist represents becomes attractive. So is there hope for a better future for the cause? I think there is. We're living through extremely difficult times. I mean, the events in the world in these days are showing that basically a large part of the population seem to have lost their heads, and they're actively encouraged so by the media and by the powers that be. But there will always be even that Christianitas minima that you were referring to might be enough to overthrow a situation, if not at first internationally. In a country like Spain, it is perfectly possible it might happen. And whatever is left of Spain is, how can I put it, strong enough to, if properly led, resist the rest of the world, at least for long enough as to encourage similar reactions elsewhere. It's happened before. Around the times of Charles VII and the Third Carlist War, there is also a revival of Jacobitism in Britain, and there's also a revival of legitimism in France, and those revivals are largely due to the Carlist example and the Carlist influence in those countries. So could we hope for something similar in the future? We certainly can hope for, and it's not at all impossible that it might happen.
Yes, I certainly share that hope and indeed intuition that following a chastisement that likely approaches, if man does not amend its ways, that Carlism will preserve old Spain, the traditions of old Spain, for the participation in the universal Christendom of the reign of Mary. But I just wonder if you could say something on the Carlist succession.
That seems to concern many people nowadays, which is of course understandable. Back in that impressive period that you previously referred to, the reorganization of Carlist under Manuel Falconde, something similar was happening then, as King Alfonso Carlos was in his 80s, and he had no issue. As you know, the Queen, Maria de las Nieves, had the habit of never separating from her husband, and that included the Third Carlist War. So at the front line, she was riding along him, and a bullet hit her horse while she was pregnant. She fell under the horse, lost the baby, and could no longer have any issue. Anyway, when their nephew died, King Don Jaime, Don Alfonso Carlos became king. But he was the last of his line. In fact, he was the last of the Bourbons of the main line. So there was a lot of unrest about what his succession might be. He was a very strong old man, and among other things, he tended to expel from the organization anyone that asked the question.
Oh, really?
Basically, like, that's my responsibility, let me deal with it. It is, what's happened with succession nowadays is a very strange thing. If you consider that the issue of Don Sixto's grandfather, Duke Robert of Parma, was very large, and that the family stayed well within a dynastical framework until the 1950s, 1960s. So there were a lot of them to choose from. You don't choose an heir, but you know what I mean. There was almost an inexhaustible supply of Bourbons of Parma. But nowadays, because of heterodoxy and because of non-dynastical marriages, there's only two Bourbons, not only Bourbons of Parma, Bourbons period, left with royal rank. And those are Don Sixto and his sister Doña Francisca. And that's it. There are no royal Bourbons left. Which brings about something that might be a nightmare in other countries, but not in Spain. Why do I say that? Because Spain's traditional laws of succession are very detailed. And what is royal succession? Royal succession is basically saying those that cannot be kings, so that the next one that can is the king. So it's simply a matter of following the lines. In this respect, the royal regulations of 1715 establish that if all male heirs of Philip V become extinct, the closest female becomes successor, and after her male issue. Now, the closest royal would be Don Sixto's sister, but unfortunately, his two oldest children died, and the remaining one, for a number of reasons I won't get into now, has lost all rights. So then we have to go up to the next one, which is Empress Sita, which is Don Sixto's aunt, his father's sister. Now, the issue of the famous Otto von Habsburg is non-dynastical, so it doesn't work for Spain. But the issue of his younger brothers is perfectly dynastical, so that would be the first call. But of course, that's something that Don Sixto himself is taking care of, and I really cannot comment any further.
No, thank you very much for your answer there, Mr. Infante. I understand the sensitivity of the subject, but similarly trust in God's providence. Well, I would like to really thank you for your time, Mr. Infante, and your elucidation of the venerable, sacral movement, the tradition of Carlism. I pray for your success in the future. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I just hope that my rusty English won't bother your listeners too much.
Not at all.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.